The Mindoro Detachment. War raging all over Luzon, High Command quickly made a chain of airfields south to Australia. One of these airfields had to be able to provide refueling, maintenance, and armament for all aircraft from the fighters to the B-17 bombers. Orders came to Fort McKinley in Manila for an all-volunteer detachment of 52 men of the 48th Materiel Squadron to service this field. Time was not wasted and the volunteers were there. Those chosen were armorers, mechanics of every type, medics, and cooks. Lieutenant Warren C. Baggett was in command of the entire detachment and Sergeant Louis Kolger became his first SGT. Weapons were a high priority for men on Luzon as only 30.03 Springfields and some 45 caliber pistols were brought along. No machine guns, grenades, nor other weapons needed for an airstrip defense. On December 13th, the Palawan, loaded to capacity, started out across Manila Bay going through appropriate clearance signals with Corregidor. The Palawan had gone through the Verde Island Passage and continued on the northern side of Mindoro to the Tablas Strait and then south to the southeast corner of Mindoro. During the journey a Japanese two-engine float plane came in as if to bomb the Palawan. Straw hats were on hand and many of the men suddenly were acting out the role of Philippine fishermen. The plane looked them over good and to everyone's amazement continued on its way. Another incident was off Tablas where the Palawan received some ineffectual machine gun fire from shore. It was a miracle no fuel was hit as this would have ended the expedition. The only harm done was the breaking up of a good blackjack game on the fantail, the players going for cover and leaving the money to the mercy of the winds. They finally arrived at San Jose. Procurement of food was a problem, but thanks to Pvt Carl N, Comeaux, detachment cook, food was always available through the help of the Philippines and other means. Staff Sergeant Louis Kolger, Comeaux would go out early in the morning and would come back with enough eggs for 52 men. He worked like a dog to feed the men. The airfield, now established, was composed of two strips on ridges crossing each other in a most natural and unique fashion. The strips were long enough for the large B-17 bombers of the 19th Bomb Group. Over the next several months the 48th provide refueling, maintenance, and armament for many aircrafts. During this time a plan was made to establish a secondary camp up in the hills to the north. This plan was made in case a sudden arrival of Japanese troops. Around March 5th this evacuation became necessary as the Japanese did arrive and a quick and daring move was made. Before evacuation a necessary task was accomplished. The 200,000 gallons of distilled alcohol was drained from the storage tanks and all tools and valuable equipment were buried to prevent capture. Private Marquez and McGehee acquired a Caraboa including a sled in which they loaded the radio, rice, and .30 caliber ammunition. The detachment moved out to the north in small groups with the Carabao sled in the rear. 3 fuel drums were also brought along. 2 drums contained gas and oil to operate the generator for the radio and the 3rd drum contained rations and ammunition. Private George Marquez, as we went along we found equipment which some of the men had discarded ahead of us. Some of this was bandoliers of .30 caliber ammunition which we quickly stored on the sled. As the detachment finally moved away from San Jose, PFC William Hammonds, known to everyone as Shorty, positioned himself looking down on the airfield. With grim determination and plenty of tracer ammunition Shorty began methodically firing at the fuel barrels, exploding one after the other. He then turned his .03 Springfield on the fuel that was stored on the train sending it up in a roar of flames, leaving nothing for the Japanese to use in their occupation of San Jose. When the secondary camp was finally reached guards were immediately posted and the camp was improved as best as could be expected. About a month and a half was spent at this camp and forays were made back to the airfield area to see what the Japanese were up to. At this camp food became very scarce, only a little rice and brown sugar remained so plans had to be made. One faithful and energetic Philippine named Tigre Cantada was a guide and a man who knew the jungles. He knew where wild caraboa were plentiful and after a few hunts they bagged a cow. Once again meat was available and Private Comeaux was busy preparing food for the men. Besides food, the men procured tobacco from patches of tobacco gardens that the natives grew on the hillsides. Some distilled alcohol was brought along but one jug was broken as its carrier stumbled and fell one day. On May 5th a message was received on the radio which shocked everyone. The message said, "This is Corregidor. We are surrendering. You are on your own. God bless you." Then only static was to be heard. The next 3 days were spent faithfully waiting to hear another message in hopes of instructions or orders, but nothing was ever to be heard. Efforts were even made to raise San Francisco, trying to let someone know their situation. But staying on the radio could prove dangerous, for the Japanese were always trying to pinpoint enemy radio transmissions. Japanese troops would eventually come into the hills after them. With the approach of the rainy season, when hundreds of jungle streams would become impassable, a move had to be made. A decision was made to move north to the coastal town of Bularacu. The Mansalay area was reached instead of Bularacu, and outrigger boats were obtained from the Philippines. Plans were made to head south in hopes of finding other friendly forces possible on Mindanao or Cebu. It was night. A storm was raging, and out across the sea went the 52 strong towards the island of Tablas. The island of Tablas was reached in spite of the storm, the shark-infested waters, and the Japanese naval vessels. Some food and water was obtained at Tablas, but the journey continued south to the island of Panay. The boats were crowded, and some men had to ride on the extended outriggers of these boats. Sickness was starting to set in. During the journey the wind came to abrupt halt. Not a sound was to be heard, and the sea looked like glass. The Filipinos, to everyone's surprise, started whistling and asked everyone to do so. According to their beliefs, whistling brought on the wind, and eventually the wind did come. The island of Panay was finally reached, where an airfield was found at Bataan. Then they sailed a few miles farther to the town of Pandan. At one point smoke could be seen where the Japanese had burned out some other barrio. There were discussions whether to go to the hills of Panay or to continue on to a more remote area. A decision was made to sail west to the island of Comeaux, which was part of the Palawan Islands. Leaving Pandan, a voyage of 83 miles was traveled until they reached the shores of Comeaux. The men had traveled from Mansalay to Comeaux in outrigger boats, and the total distance traveled was about 175 miles. 175 miles of hot blazing days, rough seas, and the ever-constant danger of the enemy. After traveling, many of the men had become sick. As the detachment landed, the people of Comeaux helped as much as they could, and the sick were taken to a small hospital. May 20th, 1942 was a day of decision, as Japanese landing craft were spotted heading toward them. Comeaux was a small island, and if the entire detachment went for the hills, they would have been tracked down one at a time. Resistance was useless, as the salt water had taken its toll on the Springfields. A quick decision was made that half of the more able-bodied men would go for the hills, and the sick would have to stay along with the others. Staff Sergeant Louis Kolger states, "I felt my duty was to stay with the men, especially the sick, since I was the first sergeant of the detachment." As the Japanese Marines captured this group, they were convinced they had them all. Private George Marquez barely escaped by jumping out the hospital window. An estimate of 22 men escaped to the hills, and 30 men surrendered. For the men who went to the hills, it was more sacrifice. PFC George Lear was captured and killed in 1943. Corporal Clayton Cronin died of malaria. Private Morris McGee died of malaria and was buried on Brooks Point, Palawan, by his close friend Private Marquez. Private Bacuzzi and Valenzuela drowned in the Sulu Sea attempting to cross to another island. The men who survived numbered about 11. Survival was not possible without the help of the people of Comeaux, who hid them from the enemy, fed them, and taught them the ways of the islands. One of these was a girl named Remy, who later became the wife of Private Calvin Hogg. The savior of many of the men were the submarines which, through intricate communication, were able to rendezvous at a pickup point to bring them to safety. Private Tom LeBlanc of Morganza, Louisiana, was one of these men who was rescued by submarine. The submariners made sure these men were given the best of treatment. Master Sergeant Roy Wilfin was not so lucky, for after he was rescued, the submarine which picked him up was sunk. The Mindoro detachment completed its mission as ordered to the end. Under trying conditions, they proved, through hard work and dedication, that a small group can be most effective. Many grounded pilots and important personnel were flown out of Bataan through San Jose and on to Australia to be given new assignments to help stem the Japanese onslaught. This detachment upheld the spirit of the 48th Materiel Squadron, as did the rest of the American and Philippine armed forces fighting in such desperate times.